Good day, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Command Post Radio Room, and I thank you for tuning in. In the last episode, we examined the bitter disaster at Coronel, which was the first defeat suffered by the Royal Navy on the open sea in more than a century, which left Rear Admiral Christopher Craddock's ship shattered at the bottom of the Pacific. Today, we turn to the immediate and overwhelming British response, the Battle of the Falkland Islands. On the morning of December 8, 1914, lookouts stationed on the heights of Sapper Hill, overlooking the remote British anchorage at Port Stanley, observed columns of thick smoke rising over the southwestern horizon. Below them in the harbor, Vice Admiral Sturdy's squadron was caught in the middle of a routine, labor-intensive coaling operation. The hulls of his flagship Invincible and her sister battlecruiser Inflexible were still heavily streaked with black dust, their decks cluttered with unstowed provisions, and their boilers cold or open for maintenance. The approaching warships belonged to Admiral Spey's German East Asia Squadron, comprising the armored cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, alongside 3 light cruisers, fresh from their overwhelming victory over a British force at Coronel 5 weeks earlier. Spey arrived at the Falklands expecting to destroy an isolated wireless station and burn a defenseless coal depot, entirely unaware that the British Admiralty had secretly rushed its newest, fastest heavy units across the Atlantic to lie in wait. Within hours, this unexpected meeting transformed into one of the most one-sided naval engagements of the First World War. This sudden encounter at the edge of the inhabited world brought 2 distinct philosophies of naval warfare into direct conflict, exposing the immense pressures operating on both commanders. For the British, the utter destruction of Craddock's squadron had caused a profound crisis of confidence in Whitehall, threatening the security of Britain's vital South Atlantic trade routes and demanding an immediate, overwhelming counterstroke. For the Germans, isolated thousands of miles from home without a secure base, every operational choice was governed by a logistical crisis, a perpetual search for coal, and the unalterable reality of half-empty ammunition magazines that could never be replenished. The central historical problem of the engagement lies in how these vulnerabilities and sudden intelligence failures converged on a single morning, forcing Spey into a fight for survival and presenting Sturdy with an absolute mandate for total annihilation. The battle raises enduring questions about the nature of command in the dreadnought era, chief among them whether overwhelming material superiority could automatically guarantee a swift, flawless tactical victory, or whether the friction of naval combat would reassert itself. The events of the day provide a window into the realities of early 20th century naval technology and the human element that directed it. The chase and subsequent gunnery duel put the controversial British battlecruiser concept, the brainchild of Admiral of the Fleet Sir John Fisher, which prioritized immense hitting power and high speed over heavy armor, to its first definitive operational test. Yet as the heavy guns opened fire, the mechanical certainty promised by industrial warships quickly dissolved into a messy chaos of thick funnel smoke, blinding cordite fumes, and violent hull vibrations that severely degraded gunnery efficiency. Beyond the clash of ironclads, the destruction of the German squadron fractured into a series of isolated, desperate pursuits among the light cruisers, where individual captains' decisions, mechanical endurance, and the grim realities of rescue operations in freezing southern waters dictated the human cost of the battle. The Falkland Islands demonstrated how the absolute calculations of strategic reinforcement and industrial design choices met the unpredictable oldest variables of seafaring warfare, the limits of coal, the accuracy of scouting, and the endurance of men under fire. News of the disaster at Coronel reached London on the morning of November 4th, precipitating an immediate crisis within the walls of the Admiralty. The total destruction of Admiral Craddock's squadron had shattered the myth of Royal Navy invincibility and left the vital merchant shipping lanes of the South Atlantic entirely exposed to Spey's raiders. The reaction in London was exceptionally swift. Within 6 hours of receiving the initial reports, Winston Churchill, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Admiral of the Fleet Sir John Fisher, the First Sea Lord, bypassed standard operational delays. They signaled Admiral Sir John Jellicoe at Scapa Flow with instructions to detach the battlecruisers Invincible and Inflexible from the Grand Fleet immediately. These heavy units were ordered to coal to capacity and steam for Devonport with all possible haste. This rapid reinforcement represented a calculated gamble by Fisher, who chose to strip the Grand Fleet of valuable capital ships in northern waters to secure a decisive material advantage in the southern hemisphere. The weapons selected for this counterstroke were the direct embodiment of Fisher's pre-war design philosophy. Completed in 1908, Invincible and Inflexible were first-generation battlecruisers, displacing 17,250 tons and capable of exceeding 25 knots. Fisher's dictum that speed is armor influenced their construction. They carried an overwhelming offensive battery of 8 12-inch guns, but sacrificed defensive protection, leaving them with vertical armor plating no thicker than that of a standard armored cruiser. Both vessels brought recent operational experience to the mission. Inflexible had spent the opening weeks of the war hunting the German battlecruiser Goeben in the Mediterranean, while Invincible had seen action under Vice Admiral David Beatty at the Battle of Heligoland Bight. Yet because these ships had been designed to hunt down and destroy lighter cruisers on the high seas, their deployment to South American waters was the first true operational test of whether their high speed and heavy ordnance could vindicate Fisher's highly controversial ship concept. This detachment of heavy units from the North Sea soon triggered severe friction within the British High Command. 5 days after the initial orders, Fisher persuaded Churchill to detach a third battlecruiser, Princess Royal, sending her to the West Indies to block Spey should the German squadron attempt to utilize the Panama Canal. This move prompted vehement protestations from Jellicoe. The commander of the Grand Fleet argued that stripping his line of battle compromised British superiority over the German high seas fleet at a moment when several of his newest dreadnoughts were not yet fully operational. Jellicoe warned the Admiralty that he could not be held responsible if his depleted force proved unable to carry out its primary task in home waters. He further contended that if a third capital ship had to be risked on foreign service, Fisher should have dispatched the older 12-inch gun New Zealand, which was far more economical in coal consumption, rather than the modern 13.5-inch gun Princess Royal. This sharp strategic debate underscored the immense institutional anxiety generated by Spey's crews, as the Admiralty willingly accepted a temporary vulnerability in the North Sea to guarantee an absolute victory in the South Atlantic. Amidst this strategic reshuffling, the Admiralty also had to address the question of operational command. Fisher's fury over the Coronel defeat initially threatened to consume the Admiralty's Chief of Staff, Vice Admiral Sturdy, whom Fisher sought to blame for Craddock's inadequate force concentration. Churchill, however, remained confident in Sturdy and refused to let his Chief of Staff become a political scapegoat. Seeking a solution that would simultaneously clear the Admiralty's internal friction and project authoritative leadership to the Southern Station, Churchill summoned Sturdy and proposed to entrust him with the absolute destruction of Spey's squadron. Sturdy accepted the assignment immediately, surrendered his staff duties to Rear Admiral Sir Henry Oliver, and departed by train for Devonport to hoist his flag aboard Invincible. Sturdy brought to the assignment a formidable, if rigid, professional background. Now at 55 years old, he had entered the Royal Navy at the age of 12, specializing in gunnery and torpedo tactics. He had earned a reputation as a methodical tactician while serving under Admiral Lord Charles Beresford, achieving promotion to Rear Admiral in 1910 and receiving a knighthood in 1913. Despite these credentials, Sturdy was widely viewed within the pre-war Admiralty as an obstinate, pedantic, and occasionally surly officer who frequently rejected subordinate counsel. Critics pointed to his recent handling of staff duties during the loss of 3 cruisers in the North Sea as evidence of a dangerous tactical inflexibility. Nevertheless, he possessed the exact qualities of methodical deliberation and professional confidence that the Admiralty required to organize a systematic hunt across thousands of miles of open ocean. Before leaving England, Sturdy was invested with the new title of Commander-in-Chief, South Atlantic and Pacific. His formal orders were singular, uncompromising, and designed to eliminate any ambiguity about his objective. He was instructed to search for the German armored cruisers and bring them to action, with all other operational considerations explicitly subordinated to that single end. To ensure maximum freedom of action, the Admiralty placed all British vessels and naval personnel across both oceans including the existing cruiser squadron under Rear Admiral Archibald Stoddard, directly under Sturdy's supreme command. Armed with this absolute mandate and the massive 12-inch guns of his battlecruisers, Sturdy prepared to lead his reinforced fleet south from Devonport. With the two battlecruisers committed, and Spey still unaware of their approach, the stage was set for a meeting whose outcome would depend as much on Cole, intelligence, and Spey's own subsequent choices as on the 12-inch guns now steaming toward the South Atlantic. At this critical juncture, the German High Command in Berlin was already debating the strategic future of Spey's squadron. Admiral Tirpitz, the State Secretary of the Imperial Naval Office, recognized that the victory at Coronel had accomplished its primary purpose of disrupting British prestige and commerce. Knowing that Spey was entirely cut off from ammunition replenishment, Tirpitz strongly advocated that the squadron abandon further offensive operations entirely. He proposed giving Spey absolute freedom to bypass the heavily monitored South American coastline altogether, suggesting instead a quiet northward breakout through the vast, empty mid-Atlantic or along the African coast. In Tirpitz's view, Spey's sole remaining objective should be to bring his ship safely back to Germany, preserving the prestige of Coronel rather than risking his irreplaceable cruisers in another major engagement. Spey's own assessments closely mirrored this cautious outlook. On November 16th, a wireless inquiry from Admiral Pohl in Berlin reached the squadron via the light cruiser Leipzig, asking for Spey's intentions and precise ammunition counts. Spey replied directly that the engagements at Coronel had severely depleted his ordnance. His two primary armored cruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, were left with barely half their original ammunition supply, while his light cruisers had only slightly more. Because these specialized shells could not be manufactured or obtained anywhere outside of Germany, Spey explicitly stated that his ultimate intention was to break through for home. However, translating this strategic intent into reality depended entirely on the availability of coal. For a steam-powered fleet on the high seas, coal was the absolute determinant of survival, and Spey's intelligence regarding his fuel supply was profoundly compromised. Berlin had sent vague promises that 40,000 tons of coal could be delivered by a neutral American steamer, but the same message warned that these chartered vessels could not be relied upon. Another 14,000 tons supposedly awaited him in the Canary Islands, but that supply hinged on Portugal remaining neutral. Desperate for a solution, Spey sent urgent requests to German agents in Montevideo and New York, ordering 10,000 tons of coal to meet him at Puerto Santa Elena on the Argentine coast. Meanwhile, at Bahia San Quentin, his crews engaged in grueling physical labor, forcing the ship to gorge themselves on every available ton of coal from their accompanying colliers, packing the internal bunkers to capacity, and stacking extra sacks directly onto the open decks. Compounding this fuel crisis was a breakdown in German intelligence. Spey knew that the British cruisers Monmouth and Good Hope had been sunk, and that Glasgow had fled the Pacific. His intelligence correctly placed the British armored cruisers Defence, Cornwall, and Carnarvon far to the north near the River Plata estuary, but the location of the old pre-dreadnought battleship Canopus remained an alarming blank. Furthermore, a German collier arriving from Punta Arenas brought a delayed report. A British merchant ship had left Port Stanley on November 15th and reported absolutely no British warships present in the Falklands. However, this report was misleading. The steamer had departed the island just before Canopus had returned to take up a static defensive position. German agents in Rio de Janeiro eventually discovered that Canopus was indeed at Port Stanley, but by the time this revelation reached Montevideo on November 20th, the German squadron had already moved out of wireless range. Spey was left with the belief that the Falkland Islands were entirely undefended. This false sense of security crystallized into a fatal decision on the morning of December 6th. Gathering his captains aboard his flagship Scharnhorst, Spey proposed a sudden, aggressive raid on Port Stanley. He argued that they could easily destroy the British wireless station, burn the colony's coal stocks to prevent their use by British pursuers, and capture the British governor in retaliation for the Allied seizure of Germany's governor in Samoa. This plan provoked immediate internal resistance. Of all the officers present, only Spey's chief of staff and Captain Schoenberg of the light cruiser Nuremberg supported the raid. The remaining captains strongly opposed the venture, arguing that they should bypass the Falklands entirely and proceed directly to the River Plata to strike at the rich Allied trade routes. Ultimately, Spee overruled the majority. Enticed by the prospect of an easy logistical prize and a defenseless harbor, he committed his squadron to the operation. As a precaution, he decided that only the armored cruiser Gneisenau and the light cruiser Nuremberg would enter the harbor to execute the raid, while the remainder of the squadron waited over the horizon. Captain Merker of the Gneisenau was instructed to draw up the formal attack plan. With this decision, Spee unwittingly steered his depleted, coal-laden cruisers directly into the path of Sturdy's 12-inch guns. Over the night of December 7th and 8th, the German ships approached the islands in clear weather, unaware that the very harbor they intended to raid now sheltered the two fastest and most heavily armed British ships in the South Atlantic. Just after 7:30 a.m. on December 8th, the surprise that Admiral Spee hoped to achieve against the Falkland Islands began to dissolve. High in the observation post on Sapper Hill, a civilian lookout spotted two distinct columns of smoke sharpening against the southwest horizon. Peering through his telescope, the spotter identified a 4-funnel and a 2-funnel warship steering northward toward Port Stanley. The latter vessel was actually the 3-funnel light cruiser Nuremberg, but the sharp angle of her approach caused the lookout to miss her central funnel. At 7:45 a.m., this intelligence was telephoned directly to the old pre-dreadnought battleship Canopus, which was deliberately grounded on a mud bank inside the inner harbor to serve as a floating fort. The British base, which Spee believed to be entirely undefended, suddenly possessed a 15-minute advance warning of the German approach. The arrival of the Sapper Hill report triggered an immediate scramble across the harbor, though Vice Admiral Sturdy reacted with calculated composure. He was in the middle of shaving in his quarters aboard his flagship Invincible when an officer burst in to announce that the German squadron had arrived. Rather than panicking, Sturdy reportedly instructed his staff to send the men to breakfast, later noting that the enemy had arrived at a highly convenient hour for him to finish dressing, order steam, and eat a substantial meal. This cool-headedness reflected Sturdy's unshakable operational confidence, but it did not delay his orders. At 8:10 a.m., signal flags mounted Invincible's halyards, commanding the armored cruiser Kent, serving as the duty guard ship, to weigh anchor immediately and proceed through the harbor's defensive mine barrier to observe the enemy. Sturdy's opening directives prepared his squadron to pivot from a position of vulnerability to an aggressive pursuit. The battlecruisers Invincible and Inflexible were ordered to cast off their attending colliers immediately, clearing their arcs of fire even while remaining stationary. Every ship in the port received orders to raise steam as rapidly as possible, clear for action, and report the moment they could sustain a speed of 12 knots. Rear Admiral Stoddart's armored cruiser, Carnarvon, was instructed to slip her moorings and prepare to engage the Germans the moment they rounded the corner of Cape Pembroke. Meanwhile, the unarmed auxiliary cruiser Macedonia, utterly unfit for a fleet action, was sent deeper into the harbor, and Canopus was ordered to open fire the moment the targets entered her zone of coverage. As the German vanguard drew near, a profound intelligence failure on the bridge of the Gneisenau sealed the fate of Spee's squadron. Staring through the binoculars from the spotting top on the foremast, the German gunnery officer, Johann Busche, detected an ominous silhouette over the low hills, the distinct tripod masts of British dreadnought capital ships. Busche immediately reported this to the bridge, but Captain Merker curtly dismissed the warning. Merker insisted that tripod masts meant dreadnoughts, and since German intelligence guaranteed that no such ships were in the South Atlantic, Busche had to be mistaken. Confident that the harbor held only light forces, Merker continued to steer Gneisenau and Nuremberg toward their intended bombardment position just 4 miles southwest of Cape Pembroke, entirely failing to transmit Busche's alarming observation to Admiral Spee aboard the Scharnhorst. This German overconfidence brought Merker's ships directly into the killing zone of the hidden Canopus. Guided by coordinates telephoned from the Sapper Hill shore post, the battleship's twin 12-inch guns in the forward turret were elevated and trained toward the oncoming ships. When the two German cruisers slowed their engines near Wolf's Rock, roughly 6 miles short of Cape Pembroke, to present their port broadsides to the wireless station, Canopus struck. At 9:20 a.m., the battleship unleashed a thunderous opening salvo that violently shook the town of Port Stanley. Though the shells fell short, the unexpected roar of heavy-caliber artillery instantly shattered Merker's illusions. The Germans hurriedly hoisted their battle flags and turned away to the southeast. Canopus fired a second salvo at 12,000 yards, missing narrowly. Some observers believed ricocheting fragments struck the base of Gneisenau's funnel. Captain Grant ordered a ceasefire, his stationary ship having successfully protected the wireless station and bought Sturdy the time required to clear the harbor. By 10:30 a.m., the reality of the Admiralty's counterstroke was laid bare as the British squadron cleared the Cape Pembroke lighthouse. Ahead of them, 5 distinct triangles of smoke retreated toward the southeastern horizon under a cloudless blue sky with maximum visibility. For Sturdy, the pristine, biting cold weather was a providential gift that guaranteed a long-range gunnery duel entirely free of the fog or mist common to these southern latitudes. Aboard Invincible, sailors hoisted 5 separate battle ensigns to ensure their flags could not all be shot away, while an officer rushed up the mast to the maintop with a camera to capture the sight of the fleeing enemy. 3 hours after the first lookout call, the British fleet had completely emerged from its harbor bottleneck, fully formed and ready to unleash its immense speed and firepower. Once clear of the harbor, Sturdy's superior speed allowed him to dictate the range and timing of the coming engagement, though the very speed that gave him an advantage would soon create its own tactical complications. As the battle progressed into the early afternoon, the open ocean east of the Falkland Islands became the arena for a major trial of early 20th century naval doctrine. The chase officially crossed into an active engagement at 12:55 p.m. Captain Richard Phillimore of the battlecruiser Inflexible initiated the firing, unleashing a 2-gun salvo from his forward turret at the German light cruiser Leipzig. The initial range was an unprecedented 16,500 yards, 4,000 yards further than any British dreadnought had ever fired at a live target. From his observation post high in Inflexible's foretop, the gunnery officer, Lieutenant Commander Rudolf Werner, watched the tall white splashes grow out of the sea 3,000 yards astern of the German formation. Shortly after, the flagship Invincible joined the firing. Within 15 minutes, as the range contracted to 13,000 yards, the massive 12-inch shells began straddling Leipzig, throwing towering columns of water that completely obscured the small vessel from view. Realizing that his lighter ships could not survive this long-range bombardment, Spee ordered his light cruisers to scatter to the south, while he turned his 2 heavy armored cruisers, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, to the northeast to engage the British capital ships. Vice Admiral Sturdy immediately grasped the maneuver. At 1:30 p.m., the German cruisers opened fire with their 8-inch guns, their early salvos falling short before the third straddled Invincible, marked by 5 distinct water columns. British observers noted the precision of the German salvos. At 1:44 p.m., Scharnhorst scored a direct hit against Invincible's side armor, causing a heavy concussion but failing to penetrate the armor. 4 minutes after Spee initiated his turn, Sturdy countered by executing a deliberate 90-degree turn to port. This maneuver placed the British battlecruisers on a parallel course with the enemy, allowing Sturdy to maintain a range of roughly 13,500 yards, well beyond the effective reach of the German secondary batteries, but within the zone of his own 12-inch ordnance. Despite their advantage in firepower, the early phase of the action exposed a serious deficiency in British gunnery techniques. During the first 30 minutes of the heavy fleet engagement, Invincible and Inflexible expended a total of 210 rounds of 12-inch ammunition, yet accomplished remarkably little. Inflexible managed 3 hits on Gneisenau, temporarily disabling an 8-inch gun and striking once below the waterline, while the flagship Invincible could claim only a single probable hit on Scharnhorst. This highly inefficient performance raised the alarming possibility that the British battlecruisers might completely empty their magazines before sinking the enemy. The primary cause of the poor gunnery was the wind, which blew from the northwest and carried dense funnel smoke and thick clouds of chocolate-colored cordite gas directly down the British line of sight. This environmental factor almost completely blinded the gunners in Invincible's midship and stern turrets, leaving only the forward turret and the gunnery officer in the foretop with a clear view of the targets. Inflexible's situation was even worse. She found herself smothered not only by her own emissions, but also by the heavy smoke drifting across from the flagship ahead. Eventually, Sturdy altered his course to clear the smoke, and the overwhelming material superiority of the 12-inch gun began to extract a horrific toll. Scharnhorst took the brunt of the punishment, her superstructure shattered and her hull repeatedly breached until she listed heavily and capsized. At 4:17 p.m., the German flagship disappeared beneath the freezing water. Every one of the 800 men on board, including Admiral Spey, went down with the ship. Because the remaining German cruiser Gneisenau was still actively firing, Sturdy's battlecruisers could not risk stopping to look for survivors. When the armored cruiser Carnarvon steamed over the same coordinates 15 minutes later, her crew found nothing but floating wreckage. With her sister ship gone, the lone Gneisenau was subjected to an hour-and-a-half-long bombardment by the two British battlecruisers. Sturdy's ships treated the immobilized German vessel as a static target, hitting her with heavy salvos that collapsed her masts, perforated her funnels, and completely flooded an engine room and a boiler room. The defense of the Gneisenau was resolute, but the mechanical devastation wrought by the British shells made further resistance physically impossible. With Scharnhorst and Gneisenau destroyed, the three German light cruisers scattered. The battle now fragmented into separate stern chases, whose outcomes depended on the individual qualities of ships, captains, and crews. At 3:45 p.m., the fleeing German light cruiser force reached a decisive breaking point and divided. Dresden, possessing a significant lead, turned sharply to the southwest. Nuremberg veered to the east, and Leipzig maintained a southerly course. This dispersal forced Captain John Luce of the British light cruiser Glasgow into an immediate tactical calculation. Luce's ship, closely supported by the armored cruisers Kent and Cornwall, had been engaging Leipzig for over an hour, but the fast Dresden already held a 16-mile advantage. With the southern sky clouding over and rain squalls threatening to ruin visibility, Luce calculated that he could not close the range on Dresden until 5:30 p.m. at the absolute earliest. To ensure the destruction of the two nearer, slower targets, Luce made the decision to abandon the chase of Dresden. As mist and drizzle swept over the ocean, Dresden grew fainter on the horizon and eventually faded from sight, escaping into the gray gloom. With Dresden gone, the pursuit of the remaining light cruisers became a test of raw mechanical and human endurance, most vividly demonstrated in the chase of Nuremberg by the British armored cruiser Kent. On paper, both vessels were evenly matched with a rated top speed of 23 knots. Kent, however, had newly repaired engines and was unusually light, having taken on no fresh coal. To close the gap, her crew engaged in a frenzied, unorthodox effort down in the boiler rooms. When their coal supplies began to dwindle, the crew began to dismantle the ship's wooden fittings to feed the furnaces. Gunnery targets, ladders, interior doors, the officers' wardroom furniture, the crew's mess tables, and even the chaplain's wooden lectern in the paymaster's desk were ripped apart and hurled into the furnaces of the boiler room. These desperate measures succeeded. By 11 a.m., Kent was making 23 knots, and by 4 p.m., she reached an unprecedented 24 knots, rapidly closing the distance to her target. This engineering feat brought the two antagonists into direct combat by early evening. At 5 p.m., as Kent drew within 11,000 yards of her stern, Nuremberg opened fire with her 4-inch guns. 9 minutes later, Kent responded with her heavier 6-inch bow turret. For nearly an hour, the long-range duel continued, without inflicting fatal structural damage to either side. Kent absorbed considerable punishment, ultimately being struck 37 times by German shells. However, the light German projectiles failed to pierce the British cruiser's main armor belt, resulting in modest casualties of 4 killed and 12 wounded, while Kent's heavier broadsides began to dismantle Nuremberg's unarmored hull, eventually slowing the German ship to a halt. At the same time, 80 miles to the north, the pursuit of Leipzig by Glasgow and Cornwall culminated in a grim tactical situation that highlighted the horrific friction of naval warfare. By early evening, Leipzig had expended her final rounds of ammunition, and her commander, Captain Hown, prepared to scuttle his vessel. The ship's valves were open, and Howe ordered his remaining 150 men to gather amidships with their life preservers. However, the German battle ensign remained flying from the mast. Captain Luce was entirely willing to accept a surrender, but under the laws of war, a ship flying its colors was still an active combatant. The German crew was physically incapable of lowering the flag because a fierce inferno raged around the base of the mainmast. One sailor who attempted to plunge through the flames to reach the halyards collapsed and burned before he could reach it. Receiving no response to his signals and seeing the flag still aloft, Luce ordered Glasgow and Cornwall to resume firing at 7:25 p.m. The renewed British salvos detonated directly inside the dense clusters of exposed men waiting on Leipzig's deck, reducing the 150 survivors to just 50 in a matter of minutes. When the British cruisers finally ceased fire and sent rescue boats forward, the scene on the water shifted from clinical destruction to a desperate battle against the environment in the fading light. Among the few remaining survivors on the burning deck of Leipzig was Captain Howe, who stood calmly sharing his last cigarette with his officers. As the British lifeboats pulled within 40 yards of the hull, Howe ordered his men into the water, walked toward the bow while still smoking, and disappeared. At 9:23 p.m., Leipzig rolled heavily to port and sank in a mass of smoke. Glasgow's boats recovered 7 officers and 10 enlisted men, while Cornwall pulled just 1 survivor from the water. Farther south, the crew of the Kent was experiencing a similarly harrowing rescue operation after finally sinking Nuremberg at 7:27 p.m. As darkness fell over the increasingly rough seas, watchmen on Kent's deck heard faint, desperate cries echoing across the water. The cruiser steamed slowly through the debris field, switching on her powerful searchlights to guide her boat crews through the rising waves. The rescue work was hampered by the intense, numbing cold of the Southern Ocean. Despite these brutal conditions, Kent maintained her search until 9 p.m., rescuing only 7 German sailors. The separate light cruiser chases had ended in the near-total elimination of Spey's vanguard, leaving only 1 survivor unaccounted for. While Kent and the Glasgow-Cornwall pair completed their work, Dresden slipped away into the labyrinth of Chilean channels, beginning a 3-month epilogue that would test British persistence and confirm the completeness of the victory won on that fateful December day. Having outrun her British pursuers, the lone German survival doubled back to the west, rounded the freezing storm-lashed Cape Horn, and slipped into the labyrinthine waterways of southern Chile. Her captain, Fritz Ludecki, navigated his vessel through the uncharted waters of the Cockburn Channel before dropping anchor at Shoal Bay, located within the wildest, most desolate expanse of Tierra del Fuego. Here, hidden among a maze of fog-shrouded islands, the fugitive cruiser sought to patch her engines and secure fuel, transforming what was meant to be a swift naval action into a prolonged maritime manhunt. For the next 3 months, the Royal Navy was forced to maintain a continuous, frustrating operational presence in the extreme latitudes of the South Atlantic and Pacific. Sturdy's primary scouting units, including Captain Luce's Glasgow and the armored cruiser Kent, were tasked with searching every fjord, inlet, and bay along the jagged Chilean coast. This campaign was defined by severe logistical environmental friction. The British crews hunted through narrow, hazardous channels lined by towering coastal mountains, sheer glaciers, and dense subantarctic forests, operating with imperfect charts and in perpetual danger of grounding. The persistence of this search underscored an enduring reality of naval warfare. A single high-speed enemy cruiser, if left unmolested, retained the potential to completely disrupt Allied merchant shipping across the entire South American station. The long pursuit finally culminated at dawn on March 14, 1915, off the remote island of Juan Fernandez. Rounding the basalt headland of Cumberland Point, the lookouts aboard Glasgow and Kent sighted a silhouette against the shore. There, anchored inside the relative sanctuary of Cumberland Bay, lay the Dresden, her hull rusted and her coal bunkers entirely depleted. The British warships immediately closed the distance, ignoring the technicalities of Chilean neutrality, to open fire on the stationary cruiser. After a brief, uneven exchange that lasted only a few minutes, Captain Ludecki hoisted a white flag and dispatched a boat to Glasgow to protest the attack, using the diplomatic delay to secure the safety of his crew. While his representatives debated the legality of the engagement with Captain Luce, Luedecke executed his final operational command. Below decks, German engineers set demolition charges and opened the valves, while the crew, many of them half-dressed from the suddenness of the morning bombardment, scrambled into lifeboats and rowed frantically for the neutral Chilean shore. At 11:15 a.m., the internal explosion detonated, and Dresden settled by the bow, slipping beneath the waters of Cumberland Bay. The destruction of this final vessel effectively closed the operational ledger on Admiral Spey's ill-fated East Asia Squadron, concluding the campaign that had begun so decisively 3 months earlier. The elimination of Dresden was not an isolated tactical success, but rather the structural cornerstone of a wider, highly successful Admiralty campaign to purge the global shipping lanes of German surface raiders. Within a matter of weeks following the action at the Falklands, the pressure exerted by British cruiser squadrons forced a complete collapse of Germany's overseas commerce-destroying infrastructure. Operating without secure bases, reliable colliers, or the mutual protection of a fleet formation, the few remaining isolated raiders scattered across the Atlantic and Indian Oceans were either hunted down or driven to exhaustion by the sheer material dominance of Allied naval power. The final phase of this chase was illustrated by the fate of Germany's armed merchant cruisers, which lacked the specialized defense and speed of regular warships. The most successful of these auxiliary raiders, the converted passenger liner Crown Prince Wilhelm, had managed to evade British patrols for 8 months by fueling from captured prizes. By the spring of 1915, however, the absolute blockade of the Atlantic and the total destruction of Spey's supply network left her completely isolated, her machinery failing and her crew suffering from severe dietary deficiencies. In April 1915, her commander voluntarily steered the crippled vessel into the neutral American port of Newport News, Virginia, to accept internment. With her surrender, the oceans were entirely cleared of German surface raiders, cementing the strategic reality that had been forged in the cold waters of the Falklands. The Battle of the Falkland Islands stands as both a dramatic reversal of Coronel and as a case study in how superior speed and heavy armament, when aligned with decisive leadership, could systematically annihilate an enemy squadron. The British victory at Port Stanley was not the inevitable result of material abundance, but rather the product of an intricate chain of decisions, logistical realities, and human calculations. It began with First Sea Lord John Fisher's pre-war design philosophy, which prioritized the devastating combination of heavy 12-inch guns and high speed, and was realized through the Admiralty's high-stakes gamble to detach vital capital ships from the North Sea at a moment of acute strategic anxiety. This British mobilization collided directly with Vice Admiral Maximilian von Spey's critical operational constraints. Blinded by faulty intelligence and starved of secure calling alternatives after his victory at Coronel, the German commander was lured into a fatal raid on the Falklands wireless station. Even when Sturdy's battlecruisers caught the German squadron in the open, the ensuing engagement proved that technological superiority did not guarantee flawless execution. Throughout the afternoon, tactical movements were constantly disrupted by the blinding effects of funnel smoke and heavy cordite gas, while the rapid depletion of British ammunition reserves raised the alarming possibility of an incomplete victory. It was ultimately the tactical initiative of individual officers, the desperate improvisation of British battle crews, and the persistence of the British pursuit that overcame these frictions, transforming an initial morning scramble into a clinical destruction of Germany's surface raiding capabilities. Beyond its immediate tactical outcome, this clash in the southern latitudes offers insight into the structural realities of early 20th century naval command, strategy, and combat effectiveness. The engagement vindicated the battlecruiser concept in the eyes of its creators by demonstrating that overwhelming speed could dictate the range and force of a running fight. Yet it simultaneously exposed severe institutional deficiencies within the Royal Navy, particularly regarding long-range gunnery doctrine. Strategically, the battle underscored the absolute dependency of modern navies on secure logistics. Without a global network of coaling stations and reliable colliers, even the most disciplined and combat-effective squadron was doomed to rapid exhaustion and eventual destruction. The campaign demonstrates that the transition to an era of dreadnoughts, wireless communication, and industrial machinery did not diminish the role of human agency or environmental chance. The grim misunderstanding over Leipzig's burning ensign, the lethal reality of the freezing subantarctic water, and Captain Hound's final calm defiance on a shattered deck all serve as an enduring reminder that even within highly mechanized systems of warfare, the ancient variables of intelligence, logistics, and human endurance remain the ultimate arbiters of victory and defeat when great powers commit their fleets to distant oceans. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Command Post Radio Room. I sincerely hope you enjoyed it. If you are new and enjoyed the episode, take a moment to subscribe. Also, please share it around. As always, comments are welcome. I'm glad to hear from everyone, your thoughts, concerns, questions, comments, and the like. Stay tuned for more, and have a great day. Command Post out.